The snow came sideways that night, not falling the way snow is supposed to fall, but driving hard and flat across the Oregon hills, like something with a purpose, like something that had decided where it was going and would not be turned aside. A woman moved through it alone. She was not young. Her hair, what could be seen of it beneath the wool pulled low over her ears, was the white of old birch bark, and her hands on the cart. Handles were the hands of someone who had spent 64 years doing the kind of work that leaves marks. The cart was loaded. Beneath the canvas, tied down with rope, were crates stacked careful and packed tight, and the woman leaned into the wind with the particular stubbornness of a person who has already decided that the weather does not get a vote. She could see the lights of Greystone below her faint and scattered in the dark, fewer than there should have been. The kind of lights a town makes when it is running low on everything, including hope. She did not stop to look at them for long. She had been watching those lights for years from her hillside, and she knew what they meant tonight, and she knew what she was carrying down to meet them. She pushed the cart forward. The wheels broke through the frozen crust of the path she had worn into the hillside over 3 years of walking it, and each step required her to pull the wheel free before the next one. And she did this without complaint, because complaint had never once in her life moved a cart downhill faster than just moving the cart downhill. That was Mabel Greer. That was who she was. But she had not always been the woman on the hill with the cart full of food in a blizzard. 3 years before this night, she had been something much simpler and much more ordinary. She had been a wife. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in May of 1885. The boy who brought it was 14 years old and could not make himself look at her when she opened the door, which told her something before the envelope told her anything. She took it from him and stood in the doorway of the house she and Edmund had lived in for 11 years. And she held it for a moment without opening it, because there is always a moment between receiving the news and knowing the news, where the world still contains the person you love, and you are not yet ready to leave that world behind. She opened it. Edmund Greer, Shaft Collapse Cascade Mining Company, Tuesday morning. The company extends its condolences. She read it twice. Then she folded it with the same precise care she gave everything her hands touched, and put it in her apron pocket, and walked back to the kitchen where she had been kneading bread when the knock came. The dough was still on the board. She pressed her palms into it and began to work it again, because her hands needed something to do while the rest of her tried to understand what had just happened. Edmund had gone into the mountain every morning for 19 years. He had come home every evening smelling of rock dust and lamp oil, and the particular cold that lives deep underground, and she had always known the way. The wife of a miner always knows that the odds accumulated with every shift, every tunnel, every foot of earth above his head. She had known it, and she had lived around that, knowing the way you live around a piece of furniture, that you cannot move stepping past it. So many times it becomes invisible until the morning it falls on you. She finished the bread. She shaped the loaves and put them in the oven and cleaned the board and washed her hands and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a long time. The company foreman came that afternoon. His name was Garrett, a broad-shouldered man with the look of someone carrying guilt that was too heavy to put down, but too awkward to carry properly. And he stood in her parlor with his hat in his hands, and his eyes moving to everything in the room except the photographs on the mantel. Edmund laughing. Edmund with a fishing rod. Edmund standing beside Mabel on their wedding day with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that it hurt to look at even now. The shaft came down fast, Garrett said. His voice was rough with the particular difficulty of a man delivering news he had delivered too many times and has not found a way to make easier. "We did what we could, Mrs. Greer. Sometimes the mountain decides." He paused. He seemed to be working himself towards something. He was alive for a few minutes after Garrett said, "He asked me to tell you something." Mabel looked at him. He said to forgive the mountain. Garrett shook his head slightly as though the message still confused him, the way it had in the moment of receiving it. He said the mountain did not know what it was doing, and he said you would understand what he meant. She did understand. Edmund had spent his working life in the deep places of the earth, and he had never once spoken of the rock around him with anything except a kind of quiet respect. He understood that mountains operated by their own logic, that a falling shaft was not malice, but simply physics that the stone did not choose, and therefore could not be blamed. He had tried to teach her this, and she had listened, and she had understood it in her head, without ever quite being able to make her heart agree. But she understood now what he had wanted her to do with it. He had wanted to free her from anger. In the last minutes of his life with the mountain still settling around him, Edmund Greer had been thinking about how to make things easier for her. That was who he was. The company sent $200 in an envelope a week later. Conscience money. Mabel accepted it without comment and put it in the tin on the kitchen shelf where she kept money that had a specific purpose even if she did not yet know what that purpose was. She was 64 years old. She had no children, no family within 500 miles, and no particular plan. She had her hands and her knowledge and the $200 and the things her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, a line of women stretching back through Tennessee, and hard seasons and the kind of survival that does not announce itself, but simply continues. She spread a map across the kitchen table one evening in late May and studied it for a long time by lamplight. She was looking for something she could not quite name, some convergence of qualities that she understood instinctively, even if she could not have listed them on paper. A place where the land was cheap, because people had decided it was worthless. A place where fruit grew wild because no one had thought to harvest it. A place where the skills her mother had given her might become the foundation of something real. Her finger moved across the map and stopped on a small dot in the foothills of the Cascade Range. Greystone, Oregon. Population 260. The marginal note said primarily a logging and mining community with limited agricultural development. Wild orchard and fruit growth noted in surrounding hills. She read those words twice. Limited agricultural development meant the fruit was going to waste. Wild orchard and fruit growth meant it was there in abundance. She had seen this combination before in other places. The particular blindness of communities built around one industry. The way they looked past everything that was not their industry, as though it existed in a different world that did not concern them. She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since the boy who brought the telegram could not look at her. She sold the house for $40, packed what she needed into the wagon, and said goodbye to 11 years of a life. She did not look back at the house as she drove away. Edmund was not in that house anymore. Edmund was in the mountain and in her hands, and in the way she thought about the world, and none of those things were staying behind. The journey to Greystone took 9 days. She traveled alone, camping beside the road at night, talking to her mare the way she talked to most things that listened without requiring her to explain herself. The mare was a dark red animal named Copper, steady and patient, and she pulled the loaded wagon up the mountain grades with the same unfussy competence that Mabel admired in any creature. She crested the final ridge on the 9th afternoon and looked down into the valley where Greystone sat against the base of the mountains. She did not look at the town first. She looked at the hillside surrounding it, the way a person with a specific kind of knowledge looks at new land, reading it the way others read a page, searching for the information that matters. What she saw on the eastern hillside caught her attention immediately and held it. The slope faced south and east. It would catch the morning sun first and hold it through the most critical drying hours of the day. The afternoon breeze came reliably across that face of the hill. She could tell by the way the grass moved, by the pattern of the trees, by the particular quality of the air coming off it. The land was steep enough to be cheap, because no one could farm it or graze it effectively. But the angle was precisely right for what she had in mind. And scattered across the surrounding hills, visible even from this distance, were the dark masses of wild plum thickets, the silver-gray tangle of old apple orchards planted by settlers who had come and gone, and the high meadows thick with huckleberries that no one was harvesting. She descended into the valley with a sense of arriving at a place she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. The land was being sold by a mining speculator named Aldous Frick, a thin man with the restless eyes of someone accustomed to looking for things that were not there. He had bought the eastern hillside 5 years before, convinced he would find silver in the rock beneath it. What he had found was nothing, and after 5 years of nothing, he was willing to take $30 for 5 acres and consider himself fortunate to get it. He accepted Mabel's money with the satisfied expression of a man who believes he has successfully relieved a foolish widow of cash she does not know how to keep. He shook her hand with the brisk efficiency of someone closing a deal he considers entirely in his favor. He did not ask why she wanted the land. He could not have imagined an answer that would have made sense to him. What Mabel did not tell Aldous Frick because it was none of his business, and because the information would have changed. His price was that the $30 she paid him for 5 acres of southeastern-facing hill with reliable afternoon airflow was the best money she had ever spent. The hill was not worthless. It was the opposite of worthless. The same qualities that made it useless for mining or farming made it ideal for something that nobody in Greystone had thought to try. It was a perfect drying hill. Her mother had taught her this when Mabel was 9 years old, standing beside the drying frames in a Tennessee summer, and learning to read the air the way other children learn to read words. You want the morning sun and the afternoon wind, her mother had said. The sun opens the fruit. The wind carries the moisture away. Get those 2 things right and everything else follows. Her mother had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from her mother. A line of knowledge passed hand to hand through generations of women who understood that summer does not last and winter does not negotiate. What Mabel was building on Aldous Frick's former disappointment of a hillside was something those women would have recognized immediately. A drying operation, a way to take the abundance of the warm months, the plums and the apples and the huckleberries and the cherries that were growing on these Oregon hills untouched and unharvested, and transform them into something that could last. Something that could sustain life when the fresh food was gone, and the supply lines failed, and the winter was the kind of winter that did not care about plans. She built the drying shed first. This decision, when it became known in Greystone, would be offered as the first evidence of her instability. A sensible woman builds herself a house before she builds anything else. A sensible woman does not spend her first weeks on a new piece of land constructing a large, peculiar building with slatted walls before she has a proper roof over her own head. Mabel was not interested in what a sensible woman did. She was interested in the fruit which was already ripening on the hillsides, and every day she delayed was a day of abundance rotting on the ground while she attended to her own comfort. The shed was 22 feet long and 10 feet wide, with walls built of space boards that let the air move freely through them without letting the rain in sideways. The roof was cedar shake, solid and well fitted. Inside, she built wooden racks at 3 levels each, holding frames of cheesecloth stretched taut over pine borders. The cloth fine enough to keep insects off the fruit, and open enough to let the air do its work. At one end, she built a small stone hearth for the wet days of autumn, when the sun alone could not finish what it started. The design came from her mother's shed in Tennessee, which had come from her grandmother's shed in the hill country, which had come from some earlier woman whose name was not recorded, but whose understanding of fruit and air and time was passed down intact through every generation that followed. Mabel built it from memory, adjusting the dimensions for the Oregon climate, knowing what she knew, and trusting what 3 generations of women had proved could be trusted. She built her cabin second, 1 room a sleeping loft, a field stone hearth, a covered porch from which she could watch the valley below. Copper got a lean-to stable attached to the north wall of the cabin, snug and protected from the mountain wind. The whole of it, land and shed and cabin and stable, had cost her $83. She had $117 left, which was enough to last a winter, if she was careful. And she was always careful. The people of Greystone did not wait long to form an opinion. News moved through small towns the way weather moved, without asking permission, and without much regard for accuracy. By the time Mabel had been in Greystone for 2 weeks, everyone in the valley knew that a widow had bought the old Frick hillside, which everyone knew was worthless, and had built a strange building on it, before building herself a house which everyone agreed was unusual, and was apparently planning to dry fruit in large quantities which nobody quite knew what to make of. She came down the hill for the first time in late August, carrying a sample of her early dried plums in a cloth sack, her cart loaded with more behind her. She went to the general store, which was the largest establishment on the main street of Greystone, and the commercial center of everything that happened in the valley. It was owned and operated by a woman named Constance Pruitt. Constance Pruitt was 58 years old and had been the sole supplier of goods to Greystone for more than a decade. She was a stout woman with iron-gray hair pulled back from a face that seemed to have been arranged by nature, specifically for disapproval. And she ran her store with the particular authority of someone who understands that controlling the supply of necessities is the same as controlling the people who need them. She was not cruel in an obvious way. She was the other kind, the kind who says reasonable things in a reasonable voice and ends up with everything arranged exactly as she wants it. She examined Mabel's dried plums with theatrical skepticism, holding one up to the light, pressing it between her fingers, bending it back and forth in a way that communicated expertise without actually requiring any. Mabel said she was not asking Constance to sell them for her. She was asking to set up a table outside the store on market days where she would sell them herself. She would not take up space inside the store. She would not interfere with the store's business. She simply needed a location where people passed. Constance said that people wanted what they knew. They wanted goods that came from proper companies with proper packaging, not something prepared in a hillside shed by a widow with time on her hands. She said it would give the wrong impression of her establishment. "It is not cooked," Mabel said. "It is dried. There is a considerable difference." "The answer is no," Constance said. Her tone had the finality of a woman who has never been successfully argued with in her own store. Mabel took her sample back and left without argument. She had lived long enough to know which walls were worth pushing against and which ones would simply fall on you if you pushed. This was a wall she would go around. The story of the refusal traveled through Greystone in the way all such stories traveled, arriving in the saloon by evening where Roland Slade was holding his customary court. Roland Slade was 52 years old and owned the largest lumber mill in the valley, which employed a significant portion of the working men of Greystone, which meant that his opinions carried the particular weight of opinions held by men whose goodwill you might need. He was a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice that he used freely and a laugh that he deployed as a weapon as often as he used it for amusement. He had built his position in Greystone over 20 years of carefully managed relationships and knew the value of social consensus, which was to say he understood that ridicule applied consistently and publicly could shape how an entire town saw a thing. When he heard about the widow on the hill and her shed full of drying fruit and her attempt to sell it from a table outside Constance Pruitt's store, he found the whole business genuinely funny. He did not need to manufacture his laughter. There was something about the image an old woman alone on a hillside filling a shed with dried plums that struck him as inherently comic. The kind of comic that does not require explanation, because everyone in the room already shares the assumption that makes it funny. 500 pounds of dried fruit, he announced to the assembled men of the saloon. The woman is building a monument to prunes. Perhaps she intends to open a shop. Slade's Dried Goods, specializing in madness by the pound. The laughter filled the saloon and moved out into the street. Mabel, on her hillside above the valley, heard it drifting up through the summer night air. She recognized the sound. She had heard it before in different rooms in different places. The particular quality of laughter that was not really about finding something funny, but about establishing for everyone present what the acceptable opinion was. She understood its function. She set down the frame she was loading and listened to it for a moment, and then picked the frame back up and continued working. Roland's wife, Vera Slade, was 48 years old and possessed a social intelligence that matched her husband's, though she applied it in different rooms. Where Roland worked the saloon and the mill floor, Vera worked the church steps and the parlor, the sewing circle and the afternoon calls, all the spaces where women shaped the beliefs of a community in ways that were no less powerful for being less visible. She organized a meeting of the Women's Auxiliary within a week of Mabel's arrival in Greystone. The meeting was framed as a discussion of the newcomer and her situation, which was the polite way of saying it was a meeting to decide what the town's women would collectively think about Mabel Greer. Vera's position was delivered with the careful moderation of someone who wants to appear fair, while making sure the conclusion is foregone. She expressed concern about the conditions in which the fruit was being prepared. The shed had open walls. Birds and insects had access. The sanitary standards of a hillside operation run by one elderly woman working alone could not be relied upon. She said she was certain Mrs. Greer meant well, adding this qualifier in the particular tone that indicated she was certain of nothing of the kind. By the end of the meeting, the verdict was settled. The operation on the hill was unsanitary, and its operator was, if not actually unstable, then certainly eccentric, in a degree that deserved pity rather than custom. It was Vera who gave it the name. She said it almost offhandedly at the end of the meeting in the way that the best social maneuvers are always executed casually, as though the name had arrived by accident rather than by intention. The Mad Shed, she called it. It fit the mood of the room perfectly, and it spread from that meeting through the town with the efficiency of something people were glad to have a name for: the Mad Shed. Mabel heard this name when she came down the hill the following market day. She heard it from the children who watched her cart go past. She heard it in the way conversations shifted when she entered a store, the particular quality of a room adjusting to a presence it is already decided about. She noted it and filed it and continued her work. There was one person who did not share the consensus. Augusta Finch was 72 years old and had been a widow for 11 years. And she had arrived at the particular freedom that some women find on the far side of great loss. The freedom of someone who has already given up what mattered most, and therefore does not need to spend any more energy protecting what remains. She lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of the valley, kept a kitchen garden, raised 4 chickens, and had long since stopped attending Vera Slade's women's auxiliary or any other gathering that required her to pretend to agree with people she did not agree with. She climbed the hill to Mabel's cabin one afternoon in early September, moving slowly but without stopping, using a walking stick on the steep sections, arriving at the porch with the deliberate expression of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through. She said she had heard what they were calling the shed. She said she had come to see it for herself. Mabel led her inside. Augusta walked the length of the shed without speaking, looking at everything with the careful attention of a woman who was taking inventory of what she saw, rather than matching it against a preconception. She examined the racks and the cheesecloth frames and the way the airflow moved through the slatted walls. She picked up a dried plum and tasted it. She stood for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she said that her mother had built a shed like this one in Tennessee before the war, and the neighbors had called her mother mad too. Right up until the war came and the supply lines collapsed, and her mother's shed full of dried fruit fed half the county for 2 winters. She paused. "May I help?" she asked. "With the harvest. My hands still work." That was the beginning of something that Mabel could not have anticipated when she drove her wagon over the ridge and looked down at Greystone for the first time. Augusta Finch became a regular presence on the hillside, coming when she could slower on some days than others, her arthritis worse in the damp weather. She helped sort and slice and lay out fruit on the frames. She shared stories of Tennessee and the women who had taught her mother what her mother had passed on, a line of knowledge that turned out to run parallel to Mabel's own, like 2 rivers from the same mountain. They sat on the porch in the late afternoons, the 2 of them watching the valley below, filled with the long gold light of the Oregon autumn, and they talked the way women talk, when they have stopped performing and are simply present with each other. Mabel had not had this since Edmund. She had not realized how much she had missed it. There was one other person in Greystone who did not follow the consensus, though his moment of deviation did not last. Hector Vane was 38 years old, a miner who worked the small silver operation on the north side of the valley, a quiet man with capable hands and the particular quality of attention in his eyes that comes from work that requires you to notice things before they become problems. He had seen Mabel being turned away from Constance Pruitt's store that first afternoon, had watched the exchange from across the street, and had felt something object in him that he could not quite name and did not entirely try to. He found her loading her sample back into the cart afterward, and approached with the awkward directness of a man unaccustomed to spontaneous social action. He said he had seen what happened. He said he would buy some of the dried fruit if she was willing to sell. She looked at him carefully. She had spent 64 years learning to read people, and what she read in Hector Vane in that moment was genuine rather than performing. She sold him 5 pounds of dried apple slices for 50 cents, which was a fair price, and he helped her load the rest into the wagon without being asked. And she thanked him, and they went their separate ways. It was a small thing, but small things in small towns have a way of becoming visible. And this one became visible when Hector Vane did not laugh at Roland Slade's prune monument joke in the saloon that evening. His silence was noted. Roland noted it himself. A few weeks after that, Hector was outside Constance Pruitt's store, unloading supplies from his mule, when Vera Slade emerged from the store and announced loudly to no one in particular that she hoped the widow from the hill would not contaminate the air with her presence as Mabel was approaching from down the street. Hector said that Mrs. Greer was no madder than anyone else in Greystone, considerably less so than some if he was being honest. Vera stiffened. She asked him to consider carefully whose side he wished to be on in this matter. He replied that he had not been aware there were sides. He thought there was just a woman trying to make her way after losing her husband, which was the same thing his mother had done when his father died in the mines. Vera had nothing to say to that. She left with her packages and her dignity and went directly to relay the conversation to her husband, which is what she always did when something required action beyond her own reach. Roland Slade was not a man who confronted problems directly when indirection was available. He did not summon Hector Vane and threaten him. He did something more effective and more deniable. He had a word with the shift supervisor at the silver operation. He mentioned in passing in the way that a man of Roland's position mentions things that young Vane seemed to have some trouble with priorities. Some trouble knowing where his loyalties lay. 3 weeks later, Hector Vane stood in the saloon on a Saturday evening with Roland Slade's hand on his shoulder and a glass of whiskey in front of him, and the full weight of the valley's employment situation pressing down on him from above. He announced that he had spoken out of turn previously. He said that Mrs. Greer's affairs were none of his business. He said a man had to focus on his own situation. Roland bought him the drink and the matter was considered settled. Mabel heard about it from Augusta. She heard it the way she heard most things that happened in Greystone, at a remove filtered through the one person in the valley who told her the truth without decoration. She listened to Augusta's account, and she said nothing in response. And she turned back to the frame she was loading and continued her work. She did not hate Hector Vane for what he had done. She understood the economics of it, the way a small town could make the cost of principal higher than a person could afford to pay. She added it to the account she kept, not out of bitterness, but out of the same careful attention to truth that she applied to everything. He had done what he had done. The record of it existed. That was all. The autumn of 1885 moved into the full abundance of harvest, and Mabel worked from before dawn until after dark, through all of it. The wild plums came first, growing thick in the creek bottoms, their fruit hanging heavy on branches that bent toward the ground. She filled baskets and loaded them onto the wooden sled she had built for copper, hauling load after load up the hill to the shed, where the frames waited. The huckleberries grew in the high meadows in carpets of blue-gray so dense she could fill a bucket without moving more than 10 feet. She dried them slowly at the lowest heat she could manage, watching for the moment when they rattled like tiny stones, but still held their shape and their color. The abandoned apple orchards on the eastern slopes were the greatest find of all. Trees planted by the first settlers neglected for years, their fruit falling ungathered to rot on the ground. Season after season, year after year. A recurring waste so established that nobody in Greystone seemed to see it as waste anymore. It had simply become part of the landscape, part of the background noise of the valley's life. Mabel saw it. She had always seen things that people stopped seeing when they saw them too often. She collected the sound apples from the branches, and the best of the fallen ones, coring and peeling and slicing them to a 1/4-inch thickness, dipping each slice briefly in salted water, to prevent browning, laying them on the frames with the precision of someone who understands that the details are not separate from the work. but are the work itself. The first batch of dried apple rings came off the frames in the late October. 40 pounds of fruit that had cost her nothing but labor transformed into something that would last for years if stored properly. Dense with sweetness light to carry nourishing in ways that went beyond calories into something harder to name, the particular quality of food made carefully by someone who knows what they are doing and why. She brought a small sample down the hill to Constance Pruitt's store, not to ask for anything, but simply to let the product speak for itself. She offered a piece to Constance. Constance declined. She said she had no interest in samples from the Mad Shed. Mabel took her sample back. She drove Copper back up the hill and put the cart away and went into the shed and stood for a moment in the quiet, looking at the rows of frames, at the organized abundance of what she had built in a season. She picked up a dried apple ring and ate it slowly in the dimming light of a late October afternoon. Outside below the hill, she could hear the sounds of Greystone settling into evening, the distant noise of the saloon, the voices of men and women moving between buildings, the ordinary life of a community that had decided she was a figure of pity and mild amusement. She picked up a second ring and ate that too. Then she lit her lamp and went back to work. The second autumn arrived with the same abundance as the first, and Mabel worked it the same way she had worked the first, which was to say, she worked it completely. She was on the hillside before the light was sufficient to see by, and she was still there when it was no longer sufficient. Moving by the glow of the lamp she carried on a hook at the shed's entrance, sorting and slicing and laying out with the efficiency of someone who does not waste time wondering if the work is worth doing, because the work has already answered that question for itself. The frames filled. The sacks accumulated against the cedar-lined walls of the storage cellar. She had dug into the hillside behind the cabin, reinforced with timber cool and dark, and smelling of the particular clean dryness that comes from food stored correctly in earth, that has never been anything but what it is. She labeled everything. Contents and date written clearly in the hand she had used for 30 years. To write lessons on a schoolroom board because legibility was a courtesy, she extended to her future self the same way she extended it to anyone else who needed to read what she had written. By the end of the second autumn, the cellar held 240 pounds. She stood at the entrance one November evening and looked at it by lantern light, and felt something that was not pride exactly, and not satisfaction exactly, but something adjacent to both of them. The feeling of a person who has done what they set out to do, and can see the evidence of it clearly in front of them. Augusta came twice a week through both autumns. She moved more slowly in the second year, her arthritis worse in the September damp. But she came and she worked, and she never mentioned the discomfort, unless Mabel asked directly. And Mabel learned not to ask directly because Augusta's answer was always the same, which was that her hands still worked and she would let Mabel know when they stopped. They had developed the companionship of two people who have stopped explaining themselves to each other, who have reached the point where a shared silence communicates as much as a conversation. Augusta would arrive in the morning with the particular expression of a woman who has walked up a steep hill without conceding anything to it, and they would work through the morning and eat at midday, and work through the afternoon, and in the late day they would sit on the porch with the valley spreading below them in the long amber light, and they would talk, or not talk, with equal ease. Augusta told her stories from Tennessee, from a time before the war, when the hills were a particular kind of abundance, and the women who knew how to work that abundance were a particular kind of necessary. She told her about her mother's shed, which had stood for 40 years and fed families through 3 hard winters, and about her grandmother's methods, which her mother had learned, and Augusta had partially learned, and which Mabel's own knowledge echoed and completed in ways that made both of them feel sometimes like inheritors of something larger than themselves. Mabel told her about Edmund. She had not told anyone about Edmund since arriving in Greystone, because there had been no one to tell, and the stories had been accumulating in her the way water accumulates behind a dam, pressing against the structure, with a weight that does not declare itself until you open a gate. She told Augusta about the particular quality of Edmund's laugh, and about the morning he had taught her to read the rock formations around a mining site, by the way the vegetation grew above them, and about the fishing rod in the photograph on the mantel of the house she had sold, and about the bread she had been making when the telegram boy came, and how she had gone back to it because her hands needed something to do. Augusta listened the way she did everything with complete attention, and without filling the silences with her own commentary, because she understood that some things need to be said into silence, rather than into a response. The third autumn brought the total in the cellar to 512 pounds. Mabel counted and recorded it on the first Saturday of November 1887, sitting at the table in her cabin, with her ledger open, and the lamp throwing its steady yellow light across the page. She wrote the number carefully. 512 pounds. Dried plums, dried apple rings, dried pear slices, dried huckleberries, pressed berry cakes, dried cherries from the wild trees she had found on the upper slope in her second summer. 3 years of work made manifest in food that would not spoil in 5 years of proper storage. She closed the ledger and put it on the shelf. What she did not know was that this number had already become known in Greystone because Augusta had mentioned it to a woman she trusted, who had mentioned it to a woman she thought she trusted. And by the time it arrived at the saloon where Roland Slade held his evening court, it had become both accurate and deeply funny. 500 pounds, Roland announced to the assembled men. The woman has lost her mind entirely. He was not performing this time, or not entirely. There was genuine bafflement in it, the confusion of a man who cannot understand why anyone would accumulate what he has decided is useless. Someone should write to the territorial asylum. He wheezed with laughter. Before she drowns the whole valley in dried apples. Constance Pruitt delivered her own verdict to the customers of her store, a more measured version, but carrying the same conclusion. The poor creature, she said, shaking her iron-gray head. 3 years of labor for nothing but a cellar full of fruit that will never be eaten. One almost pities her. Mabel heard these reports through Augusta, who delivered them with the neutral tone of someone reciting facts, rather than endorsing them. And Mabel received them the same way without apparent reaction, and went back to her work. She had long since stopped expecting Greystone to change its opinion of her, before the opinion had been tested by something stronger than words, and she had learned to live in the meantime with the kind of patient certainty that does not require external confirmation to sustain itself. She had also, over 3 years on the hillside, become something of a student of the weather. She had always paid attention to weather the way people pay attention to things they cannot control, but must navigate with a practical alertness that registered patterns without necessarily being able to name them. But the elevation of her hillside and the particular quality of Oregon mountain weather had sharpened this attention into something closer to skill. She watched the cloud formations over the Cascade Peaks, the way sailors watched the horizon, looking for the specific combinations that meant something she needed to know. Her mother had taught her a reading when she was a girl in Tennessee, a farmer's reading of the sky that had been passed down through generations of people whose survival depended on getting the season right. When the clouds gather low for 3 days running, her mother had said, "The winter will be hard. When they stay for a week, the winter will be cruel." When they do not lift at all through autumn, the winter will kill. The autumn of 1888 began with low clouds over the Cascade Peaks that did not lift. They settled onto the mountains in late September, and they stayed. Day after day, the peaks disappeared behind that gray-white ceiling. Not the turbulent, dark gray of storms in progress, but the flat, settled gray of a decision already made. The air had a dryness to it that was different from ordinary autumn dryness. A mineral quality that Mabel could not have described but recognized the way she recognized Edmund's handwriting, by something below the level of conscious identification. She began to push harder. She was already working before first light and after dark, but she pushed the boundaries of both in ways that cost her sleep she did not have to spare. She sent copper down the hill with the sledge 3 times a day instead of 2. She recruited the Pelham boys from the farm 2 miles east, 12 and 14 years old, paying them in dried fruit to help her carry baskets from the upper meadows, where the last of the huckleberries were coming in. She prioritized. She left the late apples that needed another week and took the ones that were ready now, because now was what she had. Augusta noticed the pace and asked about it one morning without preamble, the way Augusta asked about most things. Mabel told her what she had seen in the clouds. Augusta stood very still for a moment. Then she said that her mother used to say something similar about the Tennessee sky before the hard winters. Mabel said she knew. They worked through the morning without speaking much. And by afternoon, Mabel had filled the last of the open frames with the final harvest of the season, the late pear slices and the pressed cakes of dried huckleberry. And she stood at the shed entrance looking at it all and doing a kind of calculation that had nothing to do with numbers. The supply train arrived in Greystone on November 15th of 1888, and nobody in the valley understood at the time that this was the last train they would see for the better part of 3 months. The railroad's schedule printed in Portland and posted at the Greystone Depot showed trains arriving every 2 weeks through the winter as they always had. The people who printed that schedule worked in offices at sea level, in a city that received its weather as rainfall rather than as snowpack, and they had designed it for a world in which the Cascade Passes behaved as they were supposed to behave, which was to say, as they sometimes behaved in moderate years, which this was not going to be. Mabel watched the November 15th train unload from her hillside. She watched it reload with the outgoing mail and the handful of passengers and pull away down the valley toward the western passes. She watched it until it was gone from sight. Then she went down to the cellar, and she spent 2 days doing something she had not yet done, which was to move the remaining stocks from the storage room of the shed itself down into the cellar, packing them carefully, labeling everything again, making sure the earth banks around the entrance were solid and the door fitted tightly. She filled the last gaps with hay. She laid boards across the top of the earthwork and covered the boards with soil and scattered dead grass over the soil until the entrance was barely distinguishable from the surrounding hillside. She did not do this because she had a specific plan. She did it because she had lived 64 years and developed a practical instinct for the difference between what is sufficient and what is enough. And what she had in the cellar was enough, and enough deserved to be protected. She had 512 pounds of dried food in that hillside. She did not tell anyone in Greystone what she had done. The first missed train caused the kind of concern that people manage by telling themselves that delays happen and the next one will be on schedule. December 3rd came and went without the whistle from the valley that preceded the train's arrival, without the plume of steam above the tree line, without the loaded cars of flour and coffee and salt pork and ammunition and all the other necessities that Greystone could not produce for itself. The station master sent a telegram to Portland. Portland sent back a message about weather-related disruptions. and a reassurance that service would resume shortly. Shortly did not come. December 17th was the date of the next scheduled train, and it also passed without event. The station master's telegrams to Portland stopped receiving responses which he attributed to line damage from the storms, which was probably true as far as it went, but did not explain what had happened to the trains. A trapper came over the Eastern Pass on foot in late December and reported what he had seen from the high elevations, which was snow to depths that made the word snow feel inadequate. The passes to the west were closed. Not temporarily delayed, but closed the way a door closes when someone has decided the conversation is over. The locomotives that had been scheduled to clear the tracks sat frozen on sidings 100 miles distant, as useful to Greystone as the promises printed on the schedule posted at the depot. Greystone had 260 people and a general store with shelves that had entered the winter modestly stocked and were now facing a mathematics they had not been designed for. The flour went first. It always went first because it was the foundation of everything in a frontier kitchen. The thing that turned other ingredients into food, rather than just components. Constance Pruitt had a limited supply, and she stretched it with the rationing instincts of a merchant who understood scarcity even if she had not anticipated this particular version of it. She raised her prices with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided that the market will bear what the market must bear. Moving from $2 a sack to $5, then $8, then $12. Each increase announced with the expression of a woman who is sorry about the necessity, while clearly not being sorry. Then the sugar went, and the coffee, and the salt pork, and the tinned goods, and the dried beans, until the shelves that had once held the organized plenty of a well-stocked general store stood bare and accusing, as a testament to the distance between what a town thought it had and what it actually had. The hunger that settled over Greystone in January and deepened through February was not the dramatic starvation of a city under siege. It was the slower and in some ways more dispiriting process of a community running out the incremental reduction of meals from 3 to 2 to 1, the way mothers fed their children first and ate what remained the way men sat at tables where there was not enough and had no way to change that through any amount of work or want. The logging mill closed in January because the men working it did not have the energy for the work anymore, and because the cold had reached the kind of depth where equipment failures became common and dangerous. Roland Slade, who had built his position in Greystone on the foundation of the mill's productivity, found himself in the unfamiliar position of a man whose authority has outlasted the conditions that created it. He could not feed his workers. He could not feed his town. He could not do anything except sit in his large house on the main street and feel the weight of what his position actually meant when the circumstances changed. He was not eating well either. Constance Pruitt's store had nothing left to sell. She stood behind her empty counter each morning out of habit, because the store had been her life for 15 years, and she did not know what to do with herself when there was nothing to sell from it. And she looked at the bare shelves with an expression that had none of the habitual disapproval it usually carried, because disapproval requires a certain baseline of security, and that baseline was gone. Hector Vane spent the worst weeks of January working every hour of daylight. There was cutting and splitting wood that he traded to families who had run low, taking in return whatever they had to offer, which was sometimes very little. He was not doing this to redeem himself in anyone's eyes. He was doing it because it was what there was to do. But the memory of his renunciation in the saloon sat with him the way certain memories do, taking up space they have not earned, appearing at inconvenient moments with a clarity that daylight hours of physical labor could not entirely dull. He had not spoken to Mabel since the afternoon he had helped her load the cart. He crossed the street when he saw her coming, not with cruelty, but with the particular avoidance of a man who has not figured out how to look at someone he has wronged. Mabel noticed and did not alter her path and did not pursue the interaction. There would be time for all of that later. There were more pressing things. She had begun in January to think systematically about the families in Greystone and what they had and what they lacked and who was most at risk. She had the particular kind of intelligence that works by observation, rather than announcement that accumulates information over a long period without anyone noticing the accumulation. And she had been watching Greystone for 3 years from her hillside, with the attention that solitude and altitude and a naturally analytical mind had combined to create. She knew about the widow Hartley on the north end of the main street, whose woodpile had looked short in November. She knew about the Callahan family on the far edge of town, an Irish family who had arrived the previous spring. The father a laborer who could find only intermittent work, because half the employers in Greystone preferred not to hire Irish men when they had another option. The mother who had given birth to a daughter in December under circumstances that had not been ideal to begin with, and were now considerably worse. She knew about the older residents who lived alone and were too proud or too isolated to let anyone know how poorly they were managing. She went over this knowledge the way she went over her ledger methodically, and without sentiment, looking for what was there and what it required. And she watched Augusta. Augusta came to the hillside less frequently in January, which Mabel attributed to the cold and the difficulty of the climb on arthritic joints. And she did not press her. She sent small packages down, with any neighbor passing Augusta's way, wrapped cloth containing dried fruit and dried meat, and the dense berry cakes labeled with instructions for how to use them, because Augusta was too proud to accept charity directly, but could receive gifts framed as something else, or so Mabel believed. On a Tuesday in early February, Mabel waited for Augusta's step on the path below the cabin, and it did not come. She waited past the usual hour, and then past the point where it was still reasonable to expect her, and then past the point where she could tell herself there was an ordinary explanation. Augusta had never missed a Tuesday without sending word, not in 3 years, not through illness or weather, or the worst of her bad days. Mabel put on her coat and her heavy boots and went down the hill. Augusta's cabin was at the edge of the valley, a 20-minute walk in good conditions, and a 30-minute walk in the ice-crusted snow of that February morning. Mabel moved as fast as the footing allowed. The sky above was the flat white of a day that has not decided whether to snow or simply stay cold, and the air had the particular stillness of deep cold, the way sound carries differently in it, the way your own breath is the loudest thing. The cabin door was unlocked. She had not expected it to be locked. Augusta never locked her door. The interior was warm. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals overnight, but had not gone fully cold, which meant it had been fed yesterday, and possibly this morning. The woodpile outside, she had noticed in passing, was substantial, carefully stacked and covered with canvas against the snow. Enough fuel to last another 6 weeks at minimum. She did not need to look at the woodpile to understand what it meant. She understood it when she came through the door and felt the warmth of a room that had not been abandoned, and saw the tidiness of a space kept by a woman who maintained her standards regardless of circumstances. She opened the cupboard. Empty. Not recently depleted, but empty in the way that things are empty when there has been nothing in them for some time. She checked the root cellar beneath the trap door in the kitchen floor. Dust and the smell of old vegetables long since consumed. She went to the back room. Augusta lay in her bed, with her hands folded, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who has settled something in her mind and gone to sleep with that settling intact. She might have been sleeping, except that the particular quality of stillness she held was different from the stillness of sleep, was the absolute stillness that Mabel had seen once before when she pressed her palm to Edmund's chest in the hospital and found it answered nothing. She had fuel. She had heat. She had nothing to eat. Mabel sat on the edge of the bed and took Augusta's hand between both of her own. The hand was cold the way hands get cold when the body has stopped warming them cold, in a way that is different from cold weather cold, a cold that starts from inside and works outward. She held it anyway. Augusta Finch had been too proud to ask for food. She had been too proud to let anyone know that the small packages Mabel sent down the hill were not supplemental but essential. That without them she had nothing, that the cupboards had been empty for weeks. And she had been maintaining her composure and her Tuesday visits to the hillside with the determination of a woman who will not give the world the satisfaction of seeing her diminished. She had come up the hill as long as she could, right up until she could not. And then she had lain down in her bed with her hands folded and died with more dignity than the situation had any right to require of her. Warm enough, starved anyway. Mabel held the cold hand, and the grief that came up in her was large and specific. Not the general grief she had lived alongside since Edmund, but something with a different quality. Something that included the particular loss of this woman. And also something like rage at the distance between what had been necessary and what had been done. At all the Tuesdays and Fridays, she had sent packages down the hill without asking the right questions, without understanding that Augusta's pride was larger than her need, and that she had been slowly dying in a cabin with a full woodpile, while a general store 200 yards away stood empty, and a hillside 500 yards away held 500 pounds of food. She wept. She had not wept since the kitchen table in the house Edmund had left her in, since the bread dough on the board, and the telegram in her apron pocket. And the weeping that came now was the accumulated weight of everything between that morning and this one, compressed and released in the cold back room of a dead woman's cabin in an Oregon winter. When it was done, she dried her face with the back of her hand and sat for a while longer, holding Augusta's hand because there was no one else to hold it, and she did not think the hand should be alone yet. Then she let it go. She found lumber in the lean-to behind the cabin's scrapboards from some earlier repair, enough to make something plain and sufficient. She worked through the afternoon building it in the lean-to with the tools she found, hanging on the wall. Her hands clumsy with cold in the early hours, and more certain as the work progressed, the way hands become certain when they are doing something familiar. Augusta would not have wanted anything elaborate. She would have wanted functional, and she would have wanted it done without fuss. Then came the digging. The ground in February in the Oregon foothills is not the impossible frozen iron of the northern plains, but it is not easy either, and the depth required for a proper grave is not shallow. She chose the site herself, a place on Augusta's own hillside where the morning sun came first and stayed longest. A spot Augusta had sat in the previous spring when the weather was warm enough to sit outside, a spot she had spoken of with a particular quality of attention that Mabel had filed away without knowing she was filing it. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, pausing when she needed to, continuing when she could, digging the way she did everything that required more than she thought she had, by refusing to count the remaining distance and simply attending to the present foot of earth. When it was done, she went back inside and did what needed to be done to prepare Augusta for what came next. And she did it with the same careful deliberateness she gave every task that deserved respect. She buried her friend at dusk alone with the sky above the valley going from gray to the deep blue that precedes full dark. No one from Greystone came to the hillside to help her. No one in Greystone knew yet that Augusta Finch was dead. Mabel had not sent word, and she did not know whether she had failed to send word because there was no one to send, or because she was not ready yet to share this particular fact with the town that had been laughing at them both for 3 years. She stood at the head of the grave with her hands hanging at her sides, and the cold settling into the space between her coat and her skin. And she made a vow in the particular way that women of her line made vows, not with drama or ceremony, but with the flat, quiet certainty of a statement that was already true before she said it out loud. She said she would not let anyone else in Greystone die of hunger, while she had food in the ground and breath in her body. She stood there for a moment longer with the stars beginning to appear over the eastern ridge, sharp and very far away. And then she turned and walked back up the hill to her cabin. 8 days later. The knock came before dawn, before the sky had given up any of its darkness. A knock at the cabin door that was both tentative and urgent, which was the knock of someone who is not sure they have the right to be there, but has run out of alternatives. Mabel was already awake. She had not been sleeping well since Augusta had been waking in the small hours and lying in the dark, with the weight of what she was planning, and the question of timing pressing against the underside of consciousness. She was at the door before the second knock. The boy on her porch was 9 years old and very thin. He wore a coat that was not quite adequate for the cold, and boots that were a size too large, and a hat that belonged to a larger head than his, pulled down to keep it on. And he was dusted with snow from the walk up the hill, and he was shaking in the way that comes partly from cold, and partly from something that cold alone does not produce. His name was Declan Callahan, and she knew who he was because she had made it her business over 3 years to know who everyone in Greystone was, including the families at the margins that the town preferred not to look at too directly. He stood on her porch in the last dark of a February morning and looked up at her with the eyes of a child who has already seen something that children are not supposed to see. And he said the words his mother had sent him up the hill to say. He said that his baby sister had died in the night. He said her name had been Bridget, and she had been born in December, and she had never been strong. He said his mother had told him that the widow on the hill had apples. He said his mother and his brother and his father had not eaten in 2 days, and could Mabel spare anything? He got through all of this with a steadiness that must have cost him enormously. And then he stopped and waited. And Mabel looked at him for a moment in the lantern light of her open doorway. This thin boy in his father's hat, standing in the snow at the top of a steep hill. In the last hour of the night, having walked up that hill in the dark, with a dead sister at home, and a mother who sent him, because there was no one else to send. She stepped back from the door. She told him to come inside. She sat him at the table and put a blanket over his shoulders and set the kettle on and opened the shelf where she kept the working stock separate from the cellar stores. The supply she drew on for her own daily needs. She put dried apple slices in a bowl of warm water to soften, and she sliced dried pear, and she cut a berry cake in half, and she set all of it in front of him without commentary, because a hungry child does not need commentary. He ate with the focused quiet of someone who has gotten past the point where hunger feels like anything except a problem that needs solving. She watched him eat, and she thought about what she had already decided, but had not yet done, and she thought about Augusta's cold hand in hers, in the back room of a tidy cabin with a full woodpile and an empty cupboard. And she thought about the vow she had made at the foot of a grave on a hillside, while the first stars came out over the eastern ridge. She thought about 512 pounds of food in a hillside cellar. She thought about Greystone. When Declan had eaten, she told him to sit by the fire and stay warm. She told him she would go to his family's cabin directly and bring what they needed. She told him that he had done a brave thing coming up the hill in the dark, and that his mother had been right to send him. She put on her coat and her heavy boots and her wool hat and her gloves, and she went out to the cellar and she opened it. The lantern light fell across the ordered ranks of cloth sacks and cedar-lined boxes and labeled crates 3 years of early mornings and late evenings, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told repeatedly that what she was doing had no purpose arranged in the dark of an earthen room that smelled of dried fruit and cold Oregon soil. She began to load the cart. She did not load it with a little. She loaded it with as much as it would carry 2 crates of dried apple rings, a crate of dried pear, the pressed berry cakes wrapped in cloth, the dried plums that were dense with sugar and stored energy, everything she could fit beneath the canvas and tie down with rope. She worked quickly and without second-guessing because she had second-guessed herself enough in the 3 years of building this, and now the time for second-guessing was finished, and the time for use had arrived. She brought Copper out of the stable and hitched her to the cart. She went back to the cabin door and told Declan to rest by the fire, and that she would send someone for him when she could. Then she took Copper's head in her hands for a moment, the way she had always done before a difficult trip, and she looked at the old mare in the lantern light. And then she turned and she took the cart handles and she started down the hill toward the lights of Greystone, which were fewer and dimmer than they should have been. The lights of a town that was running low on everything, moving toward her in the dark below, like something that needed to be reached. She did not go to the Callahan cabin first. Declan sat by the fire, wrapped in the blanket she had put around his shoulders, eating slowly the way a child eats when his body has learned to be careful with food, taking small amounts and holding them in his mouth before swallowing. And Mabel watched him for a moment from the doorway of the shed before she went back inside to finish loading the cart. She had already decided the sequence. She had been deciding it for weeks, lying awake in the hours before dawn while the winter pressed against the cabin walls, working through the logic of it, the way she worked through any problem that had a right answer, if you were willing to think past the comfortable one. She loaded the cart in the dark, 2 crates of dried apple rings, a crate of dried pear slices, the pressed berry cakes wrapped in cloth against the cold, the dried plums that were dense with nourishment in a way that belied their small size. She packed them with the attention she gave everything she packed. Corners aligned weight, distributed canvas tied down tight enough to stay, but not so tight it could not be reached quickly. She brought Copper out of the stable and spoke to her in the low voice she used in the dark, the voice that was not quite words but carried the same intention as words, and she hitched the mare to the cart and checked the hitch twice, because checking things twice had saved her more trouble over 64 years than any other habit she had. She went back to the cabin door. She told Declan to stay by the fire. She told him she would send someone for him when she could. She told him he had done a brave thing and his mother had been right to send him. He looked up at her from the fire with the eyes that had already seen what they had seen that night, and he nodded in the careful way of a child who has learned to receive information without showing everything it costs him. She went out. The road down the hill was ice-crusted, and the cart wheels broke through with each turn, and she held the handles steady and kept Copper moving at the pace the footing allowed, which was slower than she wanted, but faster than stopping. The sky above was the particular dark of a winter night, 2 hours before dawn. Not quite black, carrying the beginning of some lighter intention in the east that had not yet committed to becoming light. Below her, Greystone showed its scattered windows fewer than a healthy town would show. At any hour, the diminished illumination of a place that had been burning through its lamp oil and its candles, and had started rationing those too. She came down the hill and through the edge of town and turned onto the main street. She stopped in front of Constance Pruitt's general store. She stood for a moment looking at it. The sign above the door was visible even in the dark. The painted letters of an establishment that had presented itself to this valley for 15 years as the reliable center of its material life. The place where you went when you needed what a life required. The windows that had once held arranged abundance held nothing. The shelves inside, she knew without needing to look, were bare, in the way that things are bare when what they were designed to hold has been consumed and not replenished. She unloaded the sawhorses from the back of the cart and set them up on the boardwalk in front of the store. She laid the plank across them and arranged the crates and unwrapped the packages and set out portions with the same methodical attention she had given the frames in the shed. Because the principle was the same, everything in its place and available for its purpose. She did all of this in the dark of a February morning before the town was awake, and when she was done, she stood behind the table and waited. The first person to come was not from the line of hungry townspeople she had been preparing for. Constance Pruitt was a light sleeper. She had been a light sleeper for 15 years because her store was on the ground floor below her bedroom, and anything that happened on her boardwalk registered in her sleep with the automatic alertness of a woman whose livelihood lived beneath her bed. The sound of a cart stopping and sawhorses being set up on the boards below her window brought her out of whatever shallow rest she had been managing, and she came down the inside stairs with a lamp in her hand and her robe wrapped around her, and opened the door and stood in the doorway of her empty store and looked at what was happening on her boardwalk in the lamp-lit dark. Mabel was adjusting the arrangement of the last crate when she heard the door. She finished what she was doing and turned. They looked at each other. The lamp Constance held threw its light forward onto the table and onto Mabel's face and back onto Constance's own, and in that light in the doorway of a store that had run out of everything it existed to provide. Constance Pruitt looked at the table and at the woman behind it, and at the fact of what was in front of her, which was that she had called this woman mad and refused her permission to sell from this boardwalk, and told her that her goods were not up to the standards of her establishment, and the establishment was now empty, and the goods were now on the boardwalk, and the people of Greystone needed them. Mabel told her there was no charge. She said she was distributing what she had to anyone who needed it, which appeared to be everyone. She said that included Constance herself if she had need. Constance opened her mouth. She closed it again. She was not a woman who lost words often, but she lost them now, standing in her own doorway looking at a table she had refused to allow on her boardwalk 3 years before. And what she lost them to was not embarrassment, but something more fundamental. The particular speechlessness of someone whose framework for understanding a situation has proven comprehensively wrong, and who has not yet built a new one. She went back inside, but she did not go upstairs. The people of Greystone came with the first light. Word moved the way it always moved in small places, person to person, at the speed of urgency. And by the time the sky over the eastern ridge had moved from dark to the flat gray of a winter dawn, the street had people in it who had not been in the street at that hour in weeks. They came with containers, cloth sacks and tin pails and ceramic crocks, and the cupped hands of children who had been brought along because there was no one to leave them with. They came with the expression that people carry when they have been waiting for something and have stopped believing it will arrive. And then it arrives an expression that is neither pure relief nor pure gratitude, but some compound of both with something like disbelief folded into it. Mabel distributed with the systematic efficiency of someone who has thought carefully about this moment for a long time. She had worked out the portions in her head over many mornings on the hill, the rough calculation of family sizes and needs, and what each type of dried food would contribute towards sustaining a body through the remaining weeks of winter. She made these decisions quietly and without making anyone feel that they were being assessed, because people who are hungry have enough difficulty without also being made to feel that their hunger is being evaluated. She explained what each thing was and how to prepare it. She showed the dried apple rings and said to put them in warm water for half an hour, that they would soften and expand, and could be simmered into something that would feed a family and last through the day. She broke one of the pressed berry cakes in half and held the pieces out to show their density, said that a piece the size of a palm carried the nourishment of a meal, and was particularly useful for people who needed to work through the cold. She spoke in the plain, direct voice she had used for 9 years of teaching, because the habits of clarity stay with you when they have been genuinely useful. Constance Pruitt came out of the store. She had gone upstairs and dressed, and she came through the store door and onto the boardwalk and stood beside Mabel at the table without speaking. She did not announce her presence or explain it. She simply took the position beside the table and began to help holding sacks open while Mabel filled them, keeping the portions organized, doing what needed to be done with the competence of a woman who has run a store for 15 years and knows how to manage the distribution of goods. Mabel did not comment on her presence. She accepted it as she accepted everything useful by incorporating it into the work. They stood together through the morning, the two of them at the table on the boardwalk in the February cold, and the line of people moved past them, and Greystone began slowly to eat. The single delivery Mabel made apart from the table came in the middle of that first morning when the line had thinned enough that Constance could manage it alone for a time. She loaded a separate package onto the cart and took Copper to the far end of the main street where the largest house sat behind its winter garden, the house of Roland Slade. Vera opened the door. She was wearing a good dress that had become too large for her over the past months, and her face had the worn quality of someone who has been managing a difficult situation alone and has run past the point where managing it is something she can continue to do without acknowledgement. She looked at Mabel on her step and at the package Mabel carried, and she had the expression of a woman looking at something she has no framework for, because the framework she had been using for 3 years had been built on certain assumptions, and none of those assumptions had survived the winter intact. Mabel asked if she could come in. Vera stepped back. In the kitchen, Mabel set her package on the table and began to work without discussion, because the work was why she had come, and discussion would not change what the work required. She filled the large pot from the pump and set it on the stove and added the dried fruit in the sequence that made the best soup: the apple rings first to soften, then the pear, then the dense plums that needed the most thyme salt from the crock by the stove, the herbs she had brought from the hill. She worked with the economy of someone who has made this soup many times in many kitchens, moving around a space she did not know, with the practical adaptability that comes from having cooked in a variety of circumstances and learned that the kitchen is always essentially the same. Vera stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall and watched. When the soup was ready, Mabel ladled it into bowls and turned to Vera and asked if Roland could have a bowl brought to him. Vera said he was in the bedroom at the end of the hall. She said he had not been strong enough to be up for more than a few hours at a time. She said it in the flat voice of exhausted fact, without the social shaping that she usually gave information about her household. Mabel carried the bowl upstairs. Roland Slade was in his bed in the room at the end of the hall. And what was there in that bed was not the large presence that had occupied so much of the valley's social landscape for 2 decades, but a man who had been reduced by weeks of inadequate nourishment to something that was the same person in the essential sense, and different in every visible one. He was awake. He watched Mabel cross the room toward him with the stillness of someone who does not have the energy to react to what they are seeing, and can only register it. She put the soup on the bedside table and adjusted the lamp and told him it needed a few minutes to cool. He said her name, Mrs. Greer. The 2 words carried more than 2 words are designed to carry, freighted with everything between the saloon and this bedroom. All the distance between who he had been and what that had cost, and where it had ended. She told him to eat while it was warm. Then she went back downstairs and finished the soup for Vera, and left what remained in the pot, and went back to the boardwalk. She came down the hill every morning for 35 days. The cart, the table, the boardwalk, the line of people. The 35 days of it had a rhythm that became familiar, the way any repeated work becomes familiar, acquiring a texture and a pace that the body learns without being told. Constance was at the table by the time Mabel arrived every morning, having apparently resolved something in herself during the first night that held through all the subsequent ones. The dried fruit did more than anyone in Greystone had believed it would do. This was not surprising to Mabel, who had eaten it through 3 winters and understood what it gave a body that needed it. But it seemed to genuinely surprise the people who ate it, who had perhaps expected something that would maintain rather than restore. Children who had been pale and still regained color and motion. Adults who had been managing the particular slow deterioration of inadequate food through weeks of physical labor found their pace and their strength coming back, with a speed that the food itself seemed barely sufficient to explain. The berry cakes were what people asked for by name. The workers who had been trying to hold up through the hardest weeks found that the dense pressed cakes did something for sustained effort that nothing else in the valley currently could. And they asked for them with the direct gratitude of people who have located a thing that solves the problem they actually have. Vera Slade came to the table on the 4th morning. She came in the line with the other people of Greystone standing in the cold, with a cloth sack over her arm, and she moved with the line until she reached the front. And she accepted what Mabel gave her with the expression of a woman who has made a decision about what this requires of her and has committed to it. She did not perform humility. She did not perform gratitude. She accepted the food and she looked at Mabel directly, and she nodded once and moved away. Mabel gave her enough for the household without making a thing of the quantity. Hector Vane came on the 5th morning. She saw him at the back of the line well before he reached the table, recognized the particular way he was carrying himself. The coat collar turned up not against the cold, but against visibility. The eyes directed at the ground. The jaw set with the specific rigidity of a man who has decided that the thing he is about to do is necessary, regardless of the cost to his pride, and who is trying to limit the cost by limiting his presence. He moved with the line the way a man moves when he is counting down to something rather than moving towards something. And when he reached the table and raised his eyes, he found Mabel looking at him with the same direct attention she gave everything in front of her. He held the look for as long as he could, which was not very long. She filled a sack with apple rings and dried pear and 2 of the berry cakes. She held it across the table toward him. She said that shame did not nourish anyone. She said to take the food home and use it well. He took the sack and he stood holding it, and he said he was sorry. He said it plainly without the qualifications that apologies often travel with, without the mitigating circumstances. He said he was sorry and he meant it in the complete sense. She told him there would be time for the rest of it later. She told him to go home to his family. He went. He turned back twice before he reached the corner, and each time the expression on his face was the expression of someone working through a reckoning that had been building for a long time and had arrived all at once. The supply train came through the Western Pass on the 9th of March, 1889. Greystone heard it before it arrived, the sound carrying down the valley. The way sound carries in cold, clear air, arriving in the ears of people who had stopped expecting it, with the force of something they had believed was gone for good. The depot filled in minutes. People came out of their houses and their shops and the church, and they stood on the platform in the cold, and they watched the cars unload with a feeling that had no clean name, too large for relief and too specific for joy. The feeling of a thing that was owed arriving very late and being received with the complicated gratitude of people who have learned in the interval not to depend on it. Mabel was at the edge of the platform. She had come down to see it because the people around her needed it to be witnessed, and she wanted to be present for that. She stood at the edge and watched, and she was glad the train had come, genuinely glad. And she was also aware with the same calm clarity she brought to everything that the train had not been what kept Greystone alive through the 96 days of its absence. She walked back up the hill in the afternoon. The gathering at the church was called for the Sunday following the train's arrival. It filled from the front and from the back and from both sides and then from the door, which was left open to the cold, because there was no room to close it. The particular quality of the gathering was not the quality of celebration. Something had happened to Greystone over the winter that had not been resolved by the arrival of a train, and everyone in the building understood this without having discussed it, the way communities sometimes understand things that they have been unable to say aloud. Constance Pruitt asked to speak. She walked to the front of the room with the steps of a woman who is prepared for something difficult and is committed to doing it without turning back. Her iron gray hair was pinned as severely as it always was, and she wore her good dress, and she had the expression of someone who has stripped away the protective layers of a position and is standing in what remains. She said that 3 years ago, a woman came to her store and asked to sell dried fruit from a table on the boardwalk outside. She said she looked at the sample that woman brought, and she refused. She said she told the woman that people wanted proper goods from proper companies, that homemade fruit from a hillside shed was below the standards of her establishment, that the arrangement would give the wrong impression. She paused. Her hands on the edge of the pulpit held it in the way that hands hold things when the body needs something solid while the mouth is doing something difficult. She said her establishment had been empty for 3 months. She said the shelves that she had presented to this town for 15 years, as the foundation of its material security, had held nothing but the evidence of their own inadequacy. She said the woman she had refused, the woman this town had called mad and eccentric, and the subject of pity had fed everyone in this room through those months. With food she had spent 3 years building on a hillside that Greystone had unanimously agreed was worthless. She turned from the pulpit and she looked at Mabel in the 3rd row from the back, the place where Mabel always sat. She said she had been wrong. She said she had been wrong about the fruit, and wrong about the methods, and wrong about the woman, and that the wrong was the kind that could not be covered by qualifications or context, just stated plainly and left there for the room to see. She said she did not expect forgiveness, but she was asking for it anyway because The alternative was to leave this room without having said the thing that needed to be said, and she was not going to do that. She sat down. Vera Slade stood. Roland had not been well enough to come. He was better, but not well enough. And Vera had decided the night before that she would speak for both of them, rather than let the gathering happen without the Slade family's voice in it, because the alternative carried its own cost, and she had already paid too many costs that came from looking away from what was required. She said that her husband had made the Mad Shed a name people used, had given the ridicule its shape and its direction in the early days when it was still forming. She said that she had given it its actual name, the specific words, and had organized the meeting of the Women's Auxiliary that turned private opinion into public consensus. She said she understood what consensus did in a town this size, and she had known what it would do, and she had done it anyway. She said she had eaten Mabel Greer's dried pears in February while her husband was in bed, and she had wept because they tasted like summer when she had forgotten what summer tasted like. She said she had brought that same food upstairs to Roland and watched the color come back into his face over the following days. And she had sat in the room watching this happen, and she had understood something during those days about the distance between what she had assumed and what was true. She said she was sorry. She said it without additions, without the ameliorating language that apologies sometimes carry to make them lighter. She said it as a plain statement of fact about who she had been and what it had cost and what she intended to do with what remained. Then she sat down. Hector Vane came to the front of the room. He walked without the hunched posture he had been carrying for 3 years. Or rather, he walked with the deliberate straightness of a man who has decided to stop accommodating a shame he is ready to name. He stood in the open space before the first row, without using the pulpit, which made it feel more exposed, which was what he wanted. He said that 3 years ago he had spoken in Mrs. Greer's defense on 2 occasions, and had meant what he said on both of them. He said that when this had made his position at the silver mine uncomfortable, he had gone to the saloon and taken back his words, and announced to the assembled men that Mrs. Greer's affairs were none of his concern. He said he had done this for a comfortable shift assignment and a drink that Roland Slade bought him, and he had done it on the specific occasions when the alternative would have cost him something, which were the only occasions when the choice between principle and convenience actually revealed anything about a man. He said he had been a coward. The word sat in the room without company because he had not surrounded it with anything softer. He said that last week Mrs. Greer had given him food for his family when she had every reason to refuse, and had told him that shame did not nourish anyone, and had sent him home without making him pay for what he had done, beyond what his own conscience was already charging him. He looked at Mabel directly for the first time in 3 years. He said he was asking whether she would be willing to teach. He said if she would share what she knew about drying and preserving fruit, he would provide whatever labor was needed. He said his hands knew carpentry and construction, and he would put them at the service of building whatever the teaching required, without pay, for as long as it took, because it was the only offer he had that was commensurate with the debt. The church held the silence of people waiting for something that has not yet been said. Mabel stood. She moved from the 3rd row from the back to the front of the room at her ordinary pace, not hurrying and not slowing. And she stood in the space where Hector had stood and turned to face the congregation, and looked at it with the same direct attention she had always given the things that were in front of her. She said her mother had taught her to dry fruit. She said her mother had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from her mother. A chain of women going back through Tennessee, and hard seasons and the specific knowledge that abundance was temporary, and what you did not preserve during the good years would be gone during the bad ones. She said she had not built 500 pounds of food on that hillside to prove a point about anyone's expectations or anyone's judgments. She said she had built it because waste was an offense to her, a specific and continuing offense. And every autumn for 3 years she had watched fruit fall from the trees on the hills around this valley and rot on the ground, while the people of Greystone ordered provisions from Portland on a railroad schedule and considered their supply to be secure. She looked around the room. She did not hurry past the faces that had difficulty meeting hers, or linger at them either. She gave each part of the room the same measured attention. She said she was not angry with anyone present. She said mockery was what people produced when they encountered something they did not understand, and the winter had produced understanding. And the question of what happened next was more useful than any accounting of what had happened before. She said she would teach anyone who wanted to learn. She said the fruit was on the hillsides every year, and the sun came over those hills every morning, and the afternoon wind across the eastern faces was reliable, and the knowledge was not complicated. She said no family in this valley needed to go hungry in a bad winter if they were willing to do the work during the good ones. She said the work was not difficult and it was not mysterious. She said it was repetitive and it required attention, and it had to be done when the fruit was ready, rather than when it was convenient. But none of that was beyond the capacity of anyone in the room. She paused. She said summer forgets. She said the shed remembers. She said that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Then she sat down. What built itself in Greystone over the summer of 1889 was not just 11 sheds on 11 hillsides, though that was the most visible evidence of it. What built itself was something that communities sometimes find after they have been through something together that they could not have survived alone. A shared orientation toward a shared understanding the particular feeling of people who have learned the same lesson at the same cost and intend to carry it forward. Hector Vane was everywhere through that summer. He had given his word in front of the congregation, and he was the kind of man for whom words given publicly became a different kind of obligation than words given privately. Not because the private ones were less serious, but because the public ones could be witnessed. And the being witnessed was itself a form of accountability he was willing to use on himself. He built faster than anyone else on the hillsides, and he asked questions when he needed to, and corrected himself when Mabel corrected him, and worked from the first light until the last with the thoroughness of a man closing a distance he had measured precisely. Constance Pruitt cleared space at the front of her store and built a section for locally produced dried goods. She displayed them in the front window with a card in her own handwriting that said, "Greystone's finest prepared by our neighbors," and she priced them fairly and paid the families who produced them fairly in return. She said to anyone who asked that it was the most honest commerce she had conducted in 15 years of running the store, because she knew the source and the method and the quality of what she was selling. And she had not always been able to say that. Vera Slade came to the hillside twice a week through June and July and August. She was not naturally suited to the physical work, and she knew it. And she came anyway, and she worked through the discomfort of not being naturally suited without complaint, because the complaint would have been beside the point. She had a social intelligence that had been applied for decades to organizing and influencing and shaping the opinions of the people around her. And she was in the process of directing that same intelligence towards something that had a different purpose. And the process was not finished and was not easy, and she kept coming. By the end of the second summer, her dried pears were as good as any Mabel had produced. She tasted one on the last afternoon of the season sitting on the porch of the shed, with the valley spreading below her in the September gold. And she was quiet for a long time. She said she had never understood what preparation was. She said she had thought it was what people did when they could not afford to depend on proper arrangements, the recourse of those without sufficient standing to simply purchase what they needed. She said she had not understood that it was something entirely different from that. That the women who built these stores against the hard seasons were not demonstrating poverty, but demonstrating a form of intelligence that only looked like poverty to people whose prosperity had insulated them from understanding what they actually needed to know. Mabel said that somewhere in Vera's family there had been a woman who understood it. She said the knowledge got lost when the times were easy. She said it could always be found again. Roland Slade came to the Hill in late April of 1890. After a recovery that had been thorough but slow walking with a cane he had acquired during the worst weeks and kept afterward because it had become part of how he moved. He came alone and without sending word first, which was itself a form of information, because Roland Slade had always sent word before arriving anywhere, had always ensured that his arrival was anticipated and received with the appropriate preparation. He stood on the porch and Mabel opened the door, and they looked at each other in the April morning light, with the directness of two people who have run out of the reasons they once had for looking away from each other. He said what he had done. He did not frame it favorably. He said he had used the position he held in the valley to make her situation more difficult, because she represented something he had not wanted to accommodate. And he had done it with the confidence of a man who had never yet encountered a situation that his influence was insufficient to shape. He said the winter had revised that understanding comprehensively. He said he was sorry in the way that men of his type say that word when they have finally arrived at it, which is with a weight that comes from how long the word has been traveling to reach the mouth. Mabel looked at him for a moment. He was thinner, and the cane changed his posture, and the combination made him look like a man who had been taken apart and reassembled slightly differently. The same person in the essential way, and different in every visible way. She said she appreciated him coming. She said she believed him. She asked if he wanted coffee. He came inside. They sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for an hour about things that were not the winter and not the 3 years before it, about the mountains and the specific quality of the light over the Cascade Peaks on clear days, and the way the valley changed color through the seasons. And it was the conversation of two people who have settled something between them without being entirely sure when the settling happened. The phrase that entered the common speech of Greystone that year was filling the shed. It became how people described not just the literal work of loading a drying shed with summer fruit, but the larger orientation. The work represented the refusal to assume that what was good now would continue without effort. The habit of doing the work of preparation during the seasons when it was possible so that the seasons when it was not possible could be endured. Parents said it to children when the fruit ripened on the hillsides, and the work of harvest pressed against the comfort of easier afternoons. Neighbors said it to each other in the way that people pass on the things that cost them something to learn. It was said with the particular quiet conviction of words that carry the memory of what it cost to not have known them sooner. On a Tuesday morning in September of 1890, with the second full harvest season since the winter running at its height, Mabel went out before any of her students arrived and sat in the chair on the porch and faced east and watched the light come over the mountains. Below her, rising from 11 points on the surrounding hillsides, were the thin, pale wisps of smoke from 11 drying sheds, and used the particular smoke of small hearths being used to finish the work of the sun on days when the sun alone was not quite sufficient. She watched the smoke for a time, without doing anything else, which was something she rarely allowed herself. the pure watching of something she had helped make, without immediately turning toward the next thing the watching suggested. She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out the folded cloth that held the telegram. She did not unfold it. She knew what it said. She had known what it said since the boy stood at her door in the Willamette Valley, with his eyes on the ground and the envelope in his hand, had known it in the way that you know, and the thing that is going to change everything before the thing itself has been named. She held the folded cloth in both hands, and she thought about Edmund. She thought about the particular quality of his laugh, and about the 19 years of mornings when he had gone into the mountain and come home in the evenings, smelling of rock dust and cold earth, and about the fishing rod. She no longer had a wall to hang it on, and about the last words he had sent back to her through the foreman, who smelled of pine sap and discomfort. She thought about the mountain he had asked her to forgive, which she had forgiven not quickly, and not without difficulty, but completely, because he had understood that she needed to, and had spent his last minutes making sure she had the reason to. She thought about the bread dough on the board, and the way her hands had needed something to do when her heart could not yet hold what had just arrived. And she thought about the map spread on the kitchen table in the lamplight, with her finger finding a small dot in the Cascade foothills. And she thought about Aldous Frick's satisfied expression as he accepted $30 for 5 acres of southeastern-facing hill that he had decided was worthless. She put the telegram back in her apron pocket. She stood up. She went into the shed. Above the door, carved into the lintel post with the chisel she had used for other things. First, and then turned to this because the words had come to her on a winter morning 2 years before, and seemed like words that deserved to be in a place where they could be read, were the lines she had put there. Summer forgets. The shed remembers. She took her apron from the hook inside the door and tied it on and picked up the frame she had left unloaded from the previous evening and carried it to the table and began the work of the morning, which was the same as the work of every morning in this season. The careful turning of abundance into sustenance, the patient transformation of what the good days offered into what the hard ones would require. Below her on the hillside she could hear the voices of the women coming up the path. 2 of Vera's neighbors who had been coming since July and were now confident enough in the work that they required less instruction than company. And further below that the sound of Hector's hammer on the new shed he was finishing for the family on the north slope who had decided this year, rather than last, to begin the work, and had asked him to help them build what they needed to start. The valley was full of the sounds of people doing the things she had spent 3 years doing alone, which was the point of all of it, which had always been the point, not the 512 pounds in her own cellar, but the 11 sheds on 11 hillsides, and the children being taught in the doorways of those sheds, by parents who had learned it the hard way and intended their children to learn it the easy one. She worked through the morning at the table with the other women, coming and going around her, and in the afternoon she went up to the high meadows for the last of the huckleberries, and in the evening she came back to the shed and finished what the afternoon had started. When the light was gone, she stood at the door of the shed and looked out at the valley below, where the lights of Greystone were coming on, one by one in the early dark. More of them than there had been in the winter of the hard year. All of them as they should be. The lights of a town that was warm and fed going about its evening with the ordinary business of people whose ordinary business has been made possible by something they mostly did not think about anymore, which was the right outcome, which was the intended one. She closed the shed door. She went inside and made her supper, from what the hillside had given, and she ate it at the table where the map had been spread all those years ago. And when she was done, she washed the plate and the cup and put them on the shelf. She went to bed. Outside over the Cascade Peaks to the east, the stars were coming out in the particular abundance that high, clear autumn air produces, sharp and numerous, and very far away. And the valley below lay quiet in the dark with its 11 sheds, cooling on their hillsides full of what summer had offered, and the people of Greystone had finally learned to receive.